You are listening to Medicine and the Machine with Medscape Editor-in-Chief Eric Topol and Master Storyteller and Clinician Abraham Verghese as they talk with experts around the globe about the hottest topics in healthcare. This podcast is intended for U.S. healthcare professionals only.
Hello, this is Eric Topol for Medicine and the Machine with my co-host, Abraham Verghese. And we're delighted today to welcome Dr. Haider Warraich, who is a physician author extraordinaire. Even though he's so young, he's already published 3 books, the latest of which is Song of Our Scars. You may know Haider. He is a cardiologist. He's at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He's a heart failure specialist, but his new book is not about heart failure at all. It's not about many things that we have discussed in our podcast, Medicine and the Machine. It's about pain. And I guess we can start. Welcome, Haider, and maybe you can tell us how you got into this whole story of pain.
Well, thank you, Eric and Abraham, for having me here talk about this. Well, I got into pain essentially on sort of a random weekday. I was in the gym when I was a medical student. I was lifting weights and then suddenly heard something, a loud click in my back. Everything stopped moving. I was, before I knew it, I was pinned under this weight. I was rushed to the emergency room by my friends, just an excruciating pain. There, I got, IV painkillers, and I was told by the emergency room physician that I'm going to feel better, and that over time I'm just going to keep getting better and better until it all goes away. And that's what I believed, but that's not really how things panned out. In fact, pain became a constant part of my life. It really took over. It took over the wheel as far as my trajectory was concerned, and for a while I wasn't even sure I could ever finish medical school, etc. And as I got better, although it took years of physical therapy, lots of support from family, friends, attendings who would let me leave early or make sure that they weren't torturing me too much in the operating room, etc. I really realized that there's a bigger story to be told here. Not just about me, but about the sensation that we call pain, which remains something that is the most common reason why people come to physicians, yet remains so poorly understood. I also happen to be an internal medicine resident at the peak of the opioid prescription epidemic, if you may, at a time when we hadn't really realized what the consequences of that practice were. So figured that so much has been written about the opioid epidemic, and obviously it's something that has brought this issue to the fore, but really we know much less about the underlying reason why we had that epidemic to begin with, and where do we go from here, as we realize that opioids are not a great treatment for especially for chronic pain.
Haider, thank you for being with us. I had the pleasure of listening to you at Grand Rounds at Stanford, and I had a burning question that I wanted to ask, which is, how is the pain doing now? Because in a sense, your own evolution with pain, I imagine, mirrors the sort of understanding we now have of pain that you reflect on in your book.
Abraham, my pain is much better, and you on the face of it, I have pretty much a normal life. I still have to be extremely careful how I sit, how I sleep, etc. It's all been changed permanently, but the specter of pain always remains in my life. Just a couple of years ago, my injury happened more than 10 years ago, and it took me a few years to sort of return to a state of normalcy. But even now, I remember I used to be in the cath lab as a cardiology fellow, and I loved doing procedures. I loved the lab, but my back just wouldn't let me pursue that as a profession. And then the other thing that was very strange was that while I was writing this book, all sorts of aches and pains came back to my life in a way that I had no idea. I mean, I think that most people think writing can be a pain in a metaphorical sense, but it really became something that I didn't expect. I would wake up with all sorts of joints refusing to work. I got shingles, which I had no idea how that happened, and so just the writing of the book itself, I think, in some way, resurrected the pain to some extent. But I am better now, although I do realize how lucky I am. It does take a lot of fortune for chronic pain to abate to whatever extent it can, but I know that so many others aren't.
I think to me that was the most interesting part of the book. I mean, I think as physicians we tend to think of pain as cut and dry. You have it or you don't, and then we put people with chronic pain into another category, which is there's a lot of prejudice around that. And I think your book was a revelation to me in terms of the pain versus our degree of appreciation of pain, depending on the circumstance and the subjectivity of it and all the ways it can be affected. Tell us more about that, if you would. I mean, that to me is fascinating.
I mean, as someone who's lived with pain, who's been writing about pain for now over a decade, I felt that I kind of knew a lot about the subject, and yet as I started researching for the book and talking to experts, talking to patients, I realized that there's so many fields in medicine that I've had the chance to take a deep dive in, but pain remains the one that I feel is most unsettled, the one that still needs to come together in a cohesive way, and that we as a medical profession just aren't geared as well for something like this, because I think it is so multidimensional, because it I think needs so much collaboration, so many different people to come together, scientists, clinicians. There's so many medical conditions that fall under the rubric of chronic pain, and that the siloing of medicine is just has really not allowed that to happen so far. And that's one of the things that I would want to do with the book, was actually connect all these different dots and put all these people together and bring all these voices together into something that's cohesive. I mean, it takes something as simple as, well, what is chronic pain? And I think even if you look at the definition of chronic pain, it's just defined as pain that you have intermittently or continuously for 3 or 6 months. But if you look at the science of chronic pain, what it shows is that, at least from a neurologic perspective, it seems to be at times a whole different process from acute pain, which is why so many things that we have that work so effectively for acute pain just don't have that same type of effectiveness for chronic pain. I mean, opioids are a great example of one of those interventions. The other thing is that even though there's been so much of an emphasis on how pharmaceutical companies, Purdue Pharma in general, affected prescription patterns and clinical practice around opioid prescription, what I think hasn't been appreciated as well is just how much they affected our very understanding of pain, and how so many of the myths and really all of frankly just lies that they introduced in the medical literature that were taught at their behest, that still continue to this day. So that's really something that we as a medical profession need to really reckon with and try and reverse, and make sure that we don't allow ourselves to be used in a way that Purdue and their other partners did, and it was so easy for them to do that.
I do want to get into the Purdue story and the epidemic that was propagated by the companies. For those of people listening who have not read Song of Our Scars, your book, or watched Dope Sick, the series that really brought this alive, it's an extraordinary, despicable way in which Purdue and the Sackler Foundation seeded the country with OxyContin. And I wonder if you can comment about that. I mean, I know you actually trace the opiates from the history, but to know that this was purposeful marketing, kept raising the doses, people dying left and right and addicted, and ruined millions of people's lives, and even now the highest number of deaths in the United States from the opioid epidemic still now. So can you frame this whole thing, because this is just an ugly part of our history?
The playbook for the current opioid epidemic was really laid first at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. Even after the Civil War, we had these new innovations like morphine and the hypodermic needle. there was, there was a lot of use of those medications during the Civil War, but then it kind of crept out into society. A lot of physicians, in fact, were at the forefront of overprescription of morphine. Then there was this new sort of company that then came out with this new product, very similar to what the OxyContin story, which was marketed as a drug that was less addictive than morphine, and in fact was prescribed for treatment of morphine addiction. That drug was heroin. And we know how all that played out. Uh, but even if you look at the Sackler brothers themselves, the patriarch of that family, Arthur Sackler, I mean, he was in fact, he's in the Medical Marketing Hall of Fame. And the first drug that he marketed was Valium. He made Valium a $1 billion drug at a time when anxiety was not even a well understood diagnosis. And the same strategy that was used to market those drugs at that time were replicated for essentially OxyContin further down the road. And so many of the things that were that we saw with OxyContin being so successful, such as the relationship between Purdue Pharma and the FDA regulators who helped pass extremely generous labels, were not only seen for OxyContin, but were seen for previous products that they brought to market. And then we've seen that that has been going on ever since for other drugs, such as a more recent Alzheimer's drug as well. So the playbook for OxyContin was unfortunately well developed, and I'm not sure if we have all the safeguards in place to make sure that something like that doesn't happen again, because again, we've been in such a rush to pin all the blame on this sort of one sort of evil sort of family and this evil group, and not actually take stock and responsibility for the fact that every one of us in the health system had a part to play, large or small, in the perpetuation of this crisis. And the people who suffered the most in this whole are patients, because first we were overprescribing these opioids to patients. At times, so at a rate so much higher than any other comparable country. And when we became sensitized to the fact that these drugs can be quite dangerous and actually, frankly, not effective for chronic pain to begin with, then we started this with almost similar zeal. We started getting people off of these drugs without, again, offering alternatives for people with chronic pain, offering them the support they might need to actually be able to deal with the dependence and the tolerance that their bodies had developed. And then that's when we've seen this diversion towards illicit drugs such as fentanyl, etc., which has now led to this skyrocketing opioid epidemic, which killed more people last year than any other year in history, more than 100,000 people for the first time. And so I really think that as a medical our entire community just needs to take pause and really need to think about how can we make sure how can we make sure something like this doesn't happen again, because I'm not sure that we've learned the lessons of this crisis.
I think one of the biggest insights for me from your book was, the understanding that the original pain that caused someone to take a painkiller has no connection with their pain many years later. In fact, this line in your book, the injury itself has no value. You're quoting one of those researchers, and I hate to admit this, it was a revelation to me that we make the assumption that people are in chronic pain because they still have the same injury. But wow, to think that it might have nothing to do with that anymore, and pain begets pain, as you say, and also that culturally we could be so different from another country in terms of these things when we have the same human bodies. Expand on that if you would.
When I got hurt, everyone in pain has their origin story, and my origin story started in that gym. And for me, the image that captured my pain was not so much a wound that I had or a scar that I had, but was this MRI that I had performed, which had this list of horrific sounding abnormalities. In fact, I was a medical student, and that MRI was discussed in one of the weekly radiology M&M conferences at that time, and that really stayed with me. I felt like this image, if anyone ever doubted why I hurt, I could show them that, look at this MRI, look at the disc prolapse, look at all these degenerative changes. And yet what we know is that MRI abnormalities have no correlation with severity of pain. They have no correlation to show which person's acute pain will turn into chronic pain. And that really the severity of the initial injury has no bearing as to whether acute pain transforms into chronic pain. And the fact is that all of this is actually very well established knowledge. I mean, a lot of what I'm bringing is in fact novel stuff that to readers, but a lot of this is very well understood and in sort of the scientific fields by the experts in this. And yet there is this big gap. The gap is between getting that knowledge not just to patients but also to clinicians, because I think pain is is so central to the mission of us as physicians. Even as a cardiologist, for example, when I'm rounding, up to a third of patients hospitalized on a general cardiology service will have a chronic pain diagnosis. They will be getting opioids or some other treatment. So it isn't something that is just being seen by one specialty, but really every specialty is seeing pain in one form or another. And there are just these simple facts and truths about pain that still remain missing. The other thing is that this idea that chronic pain is a uniquely American phenomenon is also untrue. There have been some very poorly performed studies that have suggested that Americans feel more pain than other societies, but that has in fact not been borne out. In fact, most European countries, the prevalence, even around the world, the prevalence of chronic pain is actually fairly similar between different societies. It is how we respond to that pain, how we live with pain, how we as clinicians treat pain that seems to be that in which the U.S. tends to be really an extreme outlier with regards to how aggressively we treat pain. And one of the things that's happened is that treatment of pain, or those patterns that we've developed culturally, have had these far-reaching consequences. One of my favorite studies that I came across is the fact that American people have a stronger response to placebos than any other country or any other society that we've studied. And in fact, that placebo effect is increasing over time because the belief that we've instilled in the average American patient, that their suffering is going to be relieved by a pill, by a prescription, has been just so effective that what it's doing is that it's actually making it very hard for new therapeutics to break into the market, because they just can't show a benefit over this profound placebo effect that our patients feel. So yes, there is a rich cultural aspect, there's a clinical aspect, and it isn't just something. It isn't a purely medical phenomenon. Pain is something that is as human as it gets, and to understand pain, we can't just be focused on the biology, but we really have to have as wide a lens as possible when it comes to trying to understand this.
Haider, I wanted to circle back for a moment before we get into some of the biology in the future, but you mentioned a couple of times that we don't want to see this ever happen again, but we have left it completely wide open to happen again. And I want to just get your thoughts. Why weren't any of the people leading the companies that did the Hall of Fame marketing knowingly with the people that were devastated and killed, why weren't they ever locked up and put in jail? Why was the FDA, who was complicit in these labels, why weren't they ever singled out, and why weren't they found in contempt? And why was the medical community that told doctors they need to prescribe more opiates and ablate pain, why wasn't the medical community, the National Academy, why weren't they taken out? No one is accountable. It's just extraordinary to me.
It's infuriating. I mean, if you look at another book that I would highly recommend is Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. And he wrote this really blockbuster article for the New Yorker that formed the basis of this book. And really, we have come close in the past. The lawmakers had come close to actually really pinning down the mafia-like techniques that the Sackler family had mastered in controlling every aspect of the pharmaceutical supply chain, starting from production and research all the way to affecting clinical practice. And it was by a Senator Estes Kefauver, and he had this memo in which he line by line listed I mean, what the entire strategy was. And yet what they always seem to slip by. And I just don't think that we ever had the attention span to really focus on these issues. I think that even now that's what we're seeing is that 100,000 people are dying every year, and yet the entire focus is simply on how can we get this one family get this one family accountable, and we can't even land a criminal. We can't even make sure that we can't even effectively punish this one family. But if you look at the role of all these other players, I mean, everyone has been making excuses. Everyone's been passing the buck. The medical societies have taken really no responsibility for thinking about how are we going to manage conflict of interest differently? How are we going to make sure that our medical students are not taught all these lies that are manufactured by companies without really any scrutiny, without really any type of pushback? I mean, the National Academy of Medicine put out this report and didn't even have a conflict of interest policy at that place. And it was, the majority of the people on that panel ended up having really, really strong relationships with all these companies, none of which were disclosed at the time of the publication of this report. And I remember this very vividly because I was an internal medicine resident at that point. And for me, and during the day, at night, I was getting called about all these drugs. And that was something that was new to me because I had gone to medical school in Pakistan, which, like most other countries other than the US, giving out prescriptions for opioids was not something that I commonly used to do. And so I was really struggling with what are we really doing here? And I read this whole report, and it was as if this was a marketing brochure for all these companies. And yet we have never looked back. I mean, there have been some some repercussions, but there've been nothing more than cosmetic. I mean, if you look at what's happened with Aduhelm, for example, it's essentially the same playbook has been repeated with regards to what happened at the FDA with regards to this drug and all the dealings that were going on in the back end that came out because of that Stat News inquiry. And so, I mean, and part of it, and I hope that the current leadership at the FDA, Rob Califf, who both of us know, is someone who I know cares about the opioid epidemic and cares about how it's affected the American society. But I hope that he will also look at what are the drivers at the FDA that allowed this really epidemic to get ignited. I mean, one of the sort of most shocking aspects of this whole thing was that there was this line that was written on the label, which basically said that because of its formulation, OxyContin was less addictive than other narcotics. That was based on no data. And in fact, in court testimony, Purdue Pharma said that sentence was actually added by the FDA officials, not by Purdue Pharma. And the lead reviewer for that drug, OxyContin, a couple of years after, was an executive at Purdue Pharma. We've done nothing to close the revolving door. We've done nothing to make sure that the FDA can operate outside of the influence of this industry that it is working to regulate. And so, but I really hope that this book and this moment, despite all the things that are vying for our attention in medicine and in public health, that we can pause, honor the people who are affected by this really terrible crisis, but also think about how can we make sure that this doesn't happen again. And my worry is that our rush to move on and to pass the buck and shift the blame is going to prevent us from actually having the sort of reckoning that we need.
I used to practice in Appalachia, in Tennessee, and a decade or so after I left is when the opioid epidemic sort of ravaged those same parts of the country that I had described in the early HIV epidemic. And going back and visiting and talking to my colleagues, I was impressed with, it wasn't just that pharma was pushing it, but it was also, once you had this sort of stable of patients who were addicted, there was intense pressure from them. You almost had to be willing to go to war if you wanted to say no. And so the question I have is, what do we do about the population we've left, addicted through our own fault in a sense? And how do we serve them now? How do we get them, back to normal?
This is such a huge problem that we've now created. I mean, if you look at, there's a recent study, this was a Medicaid, this is a population, this is a Medicaid analysis, which showed that if you have people who are on chronic opioids and you continue opioids at the same dose, or you increase the dose, that the risk of an overdose goes higher. But if you try to cut back on the dose, or reduce the dose, or you deprescribe the opioid, then the risk for suicide goes up in these patients. And part of that, we know how much of that is because people are then moving towards illicit drugs such as fentanyl. In fact, what's been happening is that even when deprescription of opioids has happened, so many times it is rushed. So many times it is just the decision can be quite arbitrary. I think the way forward is really having more time for patients and physicians to work together, spend time together, really think through and make a shared decision. One of the things that I really believe strongly in is offering alternative therapies for chronic pain that most of our health system has not done because they've had very little incentive to do. The main things that our health system has been offering patients have been prescriptions because they're fast and procedures because they're profitable. But what we know is that in an interdisciplinary pain management approach that, for example, that the VA has been very, very good at, is one that will include access to exercise, access to therapy, access to addiction resources. That is the gold standard for pain management. And yet, because we've had no real incentive to offer it, very few facilities now offer it. So I think this is a really, really tough question, and there are a lot of patients out there who are extremely angry, both at the health system, at physicians who really believe that opioids are this kind of wonder drug for chronic pain. And I do think that there are some patients for whom that may be true, but what the randomized trial studies have shown, what the really the mountain of evidence that we now have suggests that for people with chronic pain, opioids are no better than other alternatives such as NSAIDs or ibuprofen. In fact, and the best evidence suggests that people who have prescribed opioids actually have more pain when at 1 year follow-up. So for me, the most important things is that decisions about opioids, especially with regards to deprescription or reducing doses, should be a shared decision by patient and families and by their clinicians. I think we need to have more resources for both substance use and addiction for patients who have been given opioids and whose bodies are now extremely dependent on these medications. And then third, we need to provide additional resources, non-pharmaceutical resources for people with chronic pain to help them with their underlying condition. But again, this is going to be a tough decision, and these are tough patients. And then the other thing, and the last thing I'll mention, is that there is a pretty significant role for drugs like buprenorphine as well. The administration has made it a bit easier for more prescribers to use these medications, but again, we need an all hands on deck approach. We need the sense of urgency with regards to this problem because there's so many people who are suffering right now.
Yeah, I just would convey my N of one experience in profound pain. I wrote about in the Deep Medicine book about how when I had the knee surgery replacement and I had such pain I couldn't function, couldn't sleep. And I tried all those alternative therapies. I mean, all of them. And none of them worked. None of them provided any relief. Cold laser, hot laser, acupuncture, so, and you're so desperate. You say, I'll take the opiates. I'll take anything because I can't live with it. And it's just the temptation to become addicted is so profound. I mean, anyway, I want to just now turn to a positive thing, which is the future of pain. We now have people that have mutations, genetic mutations, that they can't sense pain. Now, that obviously is a problem because that puts them in jeopardy when they get hurt and they don't even know it. But it has identified all the receptors and pathways by which we could ablate pain and fashion drugs, new drugs that are not addictive at all, but actually work on that pathway. So could you comment about the promise in the future about, where this field is headed and we get out of addiction and get to potency?
So I must say that when I started writing this book, I wasn't very optimistic of where I would land at the end of it. But I do feel like having spoken to so many experts and really sort of and all the sort of research that's being done, I feel like we are I am much more hopeful today than I have ever been. Because first of all, and in part, unfortunately, because of the opioid epidemic, the focus on finding those sort of non-addictive therapies for pain is greater today than it has ever been. I think pain as a science is more mature today and more well developed than it's ever been. I think at least within the pain field, there have been many lessons learned about avoiding the sort of conflicts that have happened in the past between the manufacturers and the advocacy groups and the different organizations. And one of the things that's starting to happen now, but especially for chronic pain, is that in the past we've had these ideas about this resistance to accepting the fact that pain is something that is extremely complex, that is not just something that happens in your mind, but also happens not just something that happens in your body, but is as much in your mind. That pain is not just something that is a purely musculoskeletal phenomenon, but is as much a neurologic or psychologic phenomenon as anything else that we experience. So some of the most promising therapies, at least for chronic pain, are actually things that are, so one example is something called pain reprocessing therapy. So this is a form of therapy that has been tested in randomized trials, one of which was recently published in JAMA Psychiatry. And what that does is that they work with people who have chronic pain and tries to eliminate the fear aspect that pain really elicits within us, and tries to have people focus more on living their life to the fullest rather than trying to control the pain at all points. And the results from that trial were really quite stunning, and they were performed by some of the leaders in the field. And so it's that type of work which gives me hope that we are in fact now starting to put all the pieces together and really having this sort of holistic approach towards pain, especially chronic pain, that we've just lacked in the past. Having said that, I do think that right now we remain in a kind of gray area where many of those therapies are doing well in clinical trials, but haven't yet made into practice. And the desperation that we have to find something that's going to work, to find something that's going to help our patients, is at an all-time high. Which is why I think I look at what's happening, for example, with ketamine. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic. There's been some evidence for it in people with depression, PTSD, but now you have all these ketamine clinics opening up all over the country, in which for cash, people are getting these ketamine infusions, despite the fact that we have very little evidence for ketamine and chronic pain. And yet, I do think that we're at that phase where we physicians, researchers, regulators, we'll have to walk a fine line between trying our best to make sure we provide our patients relief, but at the same time not making the same mistake that we did with opioids and trying to jump the gun or to introduce things into practice before we have the right type of research present.
The book we're discussing is A Song of Our Scars, and I must say it feels like we're just scratching the surface of a very, very complex subject. The part that reassures me, I suppose, is the notion that things like placebo can be so powerful, and within placebo, the ritual of someone seeing a patient, the ritual of someone being present, putting hands on them. We're sort of in this podcast, Medicine and the Machine, we're always working that binary of hardcore science versus the fact that we're human and we're embodied beings. So thank you for shedding great light on that dyad, if you like.
I do think that this is a great setting for this subject, because I think that pain, because it lives at the border of something that is a physical sensation, an emotion, a trauma, I think it is something that you just have to put all the pieces together. And in some ways, for many people, the subjectivity of pain creates anxiety, because we've become so focused on, we've become so lucky and so used to having biomarkers and imaging and all this to guide medical decision making. But when it comes to pain, we're left to some of our most ancient tools, which is just to look at the other person in the eye and actually listen to their story. And I do think that if anything, we need to create more avenues for that to happen. We need to ensure that we're not just having a health system that is focused on maximizing profit and being most efficient, but really making and really thinking about how we can train healers as opposed to mechanics. And I think that pain is really sort of the test subject for, if we can do well with pain, then we can do well for others. I mean, I worry the same about other conditions in which we may not have that sort of magical diagnosis, or a sort of a test that can really sort of help us provide a shortcut to the clinical reasoning and decision making that we might need for something that's a bit more complex.
Well, just in wrapping up, Haider, you've already written 3 books at a young age. Modern Death, State of the Heart, and now Song of Our Scars. It's pretty remarkable. You've already had these 3 books, and you obviously love to write, love to do the research to do the writing, and then you put it in human context. That is, you're a great storyteller. So what's your next book, and what do you recommend to all those people listening about getting in more into writing? Because you obviously are a smashing success.
Well, Eric, thank you so much. I still remember you had me on this podcast a couple of years back, and you asked me the same question, and I told you I was thinking about writing a book on pain, and here I am a couple of years later. But I think right now I'm just to focus so much on this book and this work that I haven't really thought about what the future is going to be like. I think the pandemic has opened so many sort of fissures that have I think given us a real sort of hard view of where medicine stands in play and where medicine and society stand with regards to each other. I think that the misinformation epidemic that we've seen I think has been revelatory. It shows that evidence and facts alone are just not going to cut it, and that how we think in clinics, how we think in hospitals is actually very different from how people make medical decisions. But I think that's I don't think I'm ever going to write a book on the pandemic itself. This is something that I'd rather learn from people like yourself and others. But I think that the need to be able to communicate what we see in medicine has never been more important. I think what we're seeing is that the role for storytelling is in fact as important, if not more important, than showing people research, showing people data, showing people sort of fancy graphs and charts, and that the act of storytelling, which is really the heart of medicine, I think we see how important it is more than ever before. And I think the pandemic has shown both successes and failures with regards to how well we have been able to tell those stories. Some people have done it quite well, but there's so many people we haven't been able to reach because we just don't know how to reach them, or how we can frame what we see in ways that can really touch their hearts, or really help shape how they feel and think. So I think the need for writing has never been more important. I think the need for storytelling has never been more important, and if done well, I think it can be some of the most impactful stuff that we do as physicians and clinicians, for sure. So I hope that listeners will see what people like yourself and Dr. Verghese have been able to do with the pen or the keyboard, and really sort of take heart. Because stories are just such an integral part of what we do, and the impact that effective storytelling can have, no amount of clinic visits or can match that, for sure.
The book is Song of Our Scars. Haider, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Haider. We'll get you back when your 4th book comes out someday, and really enjoyed the conversation. And hopefully some of these things that have been left undone, like you say, the all hands on deck that's needed here, will at some point get activated.
No, thank you both for having me. It's truly an honor.